When you're researching for a paper or some other project for your class, you have to find your information from a source, and a source could be a lot of different things. One requirement your teacher may have, or one aspect you may want to think about, is whether your source is a primary or a secondary source. Primary sources are sources that are as close to the event or the person or the phenomena that you are describing. So it's primary, whereas a secondary source is a step removed from that event or person or experiment. And that secondary source is going to analyze what others have said who were actually there. So a primary source provides a firsthand account or gives evidence about people, events, or phenomena, and it was created at that exact time or shortly after. When you use a primary source in your writing, it shows credibility, because the closer we can get to that event or person or experiment, the more accurate it likely is. Now, that being said, we're all human. When we describe events, we all come at it with our own perspectives, biases, and opinions. So no first-hand account or second-hand account is going to be completely accurate. But it can also be helpful to have secondary sources, and secondary sources would combine information from a lot of different primary sources, and they might analyze and give commentary. Maybe when you look individually at one event, you can't see a greater pattern, but when you look at a number of similar events, you start to see some patterns. They might provide quotes from other sources, give expert opinions, give context, explain the background, what was happening at that time. So a secondary source can be very helpful too. The important thing is that you know what type of source it is so that you can use your sources effectively based on whether it's a primary or a secondary source. I wanted to talk to you about some primary and secondary sources and give you some examples. So right here we have an older book, Ye Kingdom of Accomac of the Eastern Shore of Virginia in the 17th Century by Jennings Cropper Wise. And in it we have a historian's quote of John Smith's own personal account of when he traveled along the Eastern Shore of Virginia and around the Chesapeake Bay. So the historian is using a primary source. Right here, we have a book called Landfall Along the Chesapeake by Susan Schmidt. And she traveled John Smith's route. And so this is her personal account. So this would be a primary source of her journey. This book right here is called Milestone Documents in World History, and it contains lots of primary sources. I just paged through. Right here we have the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So Gandhi's speech. We have Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations. So lots of primary sources from historical government events. Now I want to show you some books about Maya Angelou. First, we have her own autobiography. So that would be a primary source because it's not a historian's perspective. It is Maya Angelou's perspective on her own life. This book, however, is a historian's perspective on Maya Angelou's life. So this would be a secondary source. And again, this book is called Critical Insights, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And it is a number of essays about Maya Angelou's poetry. So it is other people commenting on her writings. So this would again be a secondary source because it is quoting and analyzing her work. Here are some tricky examples when it comes to primary and secondary sources. It's very tricky because a source can be a primary or a secondary source depending on how it is used. If, for example, your average fictional movie, let's take Aquaman, for example. That's its own work of art, and perhaps you are analyzing that work of art for its characterization, plot, line, themes, etc. So that movie itself would be a primary source if you are analyzing the movie, if that's what your paper is about. However, a documentary is going to be a secondary source because the documentary takes a number of different primary sources about an event or a place or person or whatever and puts those together. It adds in some expert opinions, some secondary sources. It combines all of these, making that a secondary source. Now, if you were to try to understand a time period based on a movie about that time period, that's likely going to be a secondary source. Obviously, you probably wouldn't look to a fictional movie for complete accuracy about that time period, but maybe if this is a Dickens movie and Charles Dickens lived in that time period, maybe that would be revealing about what that time period would be like. So that would be a secondary source for that time period, because you're not analyzing the storyline or the actual movie itself, you're analyzing the historical time. And obviously, the movie was not created during that historical time. So it's removed from that time. It's a secondary source. If you were looking at a movie review that is analyzing a movie, that movie review is going to be a secondary source about the movie. So if you're writing about the movie Aquaman, for example, again, then a movie review about Aquaman is going to be a secondary source. However, if you aren't writing about Aquaman, but you're writing about how popular or not popular Aquaman was, if that's what your paper is about, then the movie review is going to be a primary source because it is a primary source about the movie's reception, which is what your topic's about. So let's take a look at these sources and see if you can figure out whether it's generally a primary or secondary source. Remember, with each one, it depends on how it's used. We have a person's journal or diary, a newspaper, an autobiography, a painting, a textbook, a movie review, data from generally an experiment or poll, an encyclopedia, an email, or an interview. So our primary sources are in green, remembering again that it could be different depending on how it's used, but a journal or a diary is generally that person's firsthand account of what they experienced. An autobiography, again, is one person's account of their experience. Data coming exactly from a specific experiment or a specific poll is going to be a primary source. Now, if it was data combining data from multiple sources, then that would be a secondary source. A painting is going to generally be a work of art that people might analyze, but the actual painting itself is going to be the primary source that's being analyzed. An email or an interview is the firsthand, the words that a person uses, and so generally that's going to be a primary source. Maybe if that email or interview is with an expert and they're talking about another event or person or phenomena, then that email or interview would be a secondary source. But for the most part, that's going to be a primary source. Newspapers are generally going to be a secondary source because they're combining information from a number of different places. However, in some instances, it could be a primary source, especially you might think about a historical newspaper that has quotes from people who were right there at that time period that you are writing about. A textbook's gonna be combining of sources to give you information. So that's going to be a secondary source. A movie review we talked about would likely be a secondary source about the movie, which would be the primary source. An encyclopedia, again, is combining a lot of different information. So that would be a secondary source.